pregnant pause. Okay, we are live. Hello, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona. Thanks for tuning in this afternoon. And we are delighted to have Sally Smith with us. She's going to be talking about the brand new book, A Case of Life and Limb. I'm trying to keep it in the frame. Here's the edition right here. We actually have copies of the UK edition as well. And there's a slight difference, which Sally can explain to you on the cover design. And what else, Barbara? We're going to have copies of the British paperback of the first book in the series, which should be coming in fairly soon.
Well, it's called The Case of Mice and Murder, and if I order it this afternoon, we should have it Monday or Tuesday. They have very rapid delivery service from their U.S. branch, and we're only doing that because the U.S. excuse me, the U.S. publisher is not bringing out the paperback of A Case of Mice and Murder for a little while. Oftentimes, there's a gap in timing, but
Right,
I think that it
right.
should be available now, right? And Sally will get the same result, whether we sell the British paperback or the US one. So it's
Well,
all,
thank you.
but you're entirely welcome. Anyway,
So, yeah, so if you have questions for Sally, go ahead and type them in the comments field. I'll put a link also for both editions of the book. And then if you have any questions, I'll come back towards the end of the hour and happy to ask some of those questions. So Barbara, over to you.
thank you very much, Patrick. And if you give me an hour after this event, the order link for the paperback of A Case of Mice and Murder will be live. But anyway, what a pleasure to talk to Sally again. I just absolutely love these books. This is the second, and there's an extensive note in the back. Let me first introduce you to Sally in case you didn't watch our video last year for A Case of Mice and Murder. She spent all her working life as a barrister and later King's Counsel. You know, it was this fast switch from QC to KC, wasn't it, Sally?
Absolutely, yes. Overnight,
It
overnight.
was. You'd been a QC all along there, but anyway,
Yes.
in the Inner Temple. After writing a biography of the Edwardian barrister Sir Edward Marshall Hall, KC, Sally retired from the bar to write full-time. Her series of mystery novels starring the reluctant sleuth Sir Gabriel Ward KC, only, yeah, he was a KC because it was Edward,
Was.
right? Edward the
Yes.
Seventh.
Yes.
Is inspired by the historic surroundings of the Inner Temple in which she still lives and works, and by the rich history contained in the Inner Temple archives. So there's a long note here about the Inner Temple, but Sally, why don't you tell readers who may not be familiar with it about the four courts of law in London and
Sure.
what the difference is?
Sure. The four inns of court are, well, I should start off by saying barristers are, I think, what you call trial lawyers.
Mhm.
But in England, they're the ones in the wigs and gowns who go into court and argue cases. And they are trained historically in one of what are called the inns of court in London, which are physical places. They're Gray's Inn, Lincoln's Inn, and then Inner and Middle Temple. And the four inns of court are the equivalent of a postgraduate university. You go there and they call you to the bar, and so you can become a barrister. And they're absolutely ancient. I mean, certainly back to the early 1300s. And they operate like Oxbridge colleges, really, with gardens and a library and a dining hall. And in the case of the temple, the inner and the middle temple are united by the church that stands in the middle and is also incredibly historic, even way back, built in 1185 by the Knights Crusaders. So it's a very beautiful historical area. And as I say, the lawyers laid claim to it in the 1300s, and to this day, barristers have to be called to the bar by one of the inns of court. And then, although they may practice in other parts of England, many of them stay and practice within that inn of court, as I did myself. And in my case, I'm lucky enough to have a flat there as well. So, like my hero in my books, I both live and work in the temple.
Boy, you are lucky. So I was telling Sally last time we talked that inspired by her book, I went to the temple are located on the opposite sides of Fleet Street. The temples in Sally's book are between Fleet Street and the Embankment, and then the other two Inns of Court are on the north side. Now, years ago, when I was traveling around in England going to Oxford, I dated a solicitor, not a barrister, but I was allowed to attend some trials and to visit the courts on the north side. And
Yes.
there's a bar there where journalists and solicitors and all hang out on Fleet Street, right opposite one of the historic buildings. So I was,
Yes.
had
Yeah.
lunch there a time or two.
Great.
And that was all really good fun. But anyway, I hadn't been to see the inner temple that Sally writes about. So I did. And by good fortune, on the Fleet Street side, which is the entrance, because it's pretty much barred on the embankment side, there was a very kind guard. So when I told him why I was there, he thought that it would be all right if I went in and toured around.
Great. Great.
So yeah, but it's true also that the British tend to let Americans do things that they would not necessarily let a British person do. I've had some very interesting experiences. Particularly, I don't think I ever told you this, but years ago, maybe it was even back then, I was staying in Berkeley Square at the Berkeley, and I thought I'd wind it up by going to the Ritz for tea. So the only question I had for myself was whether I really wanted to spend that much money for afternoon tea. But it never occurred to me that the Ritz wouldn't be happy to see me. I mean, there I was, right? A reasonable person with money. And earlier that morning, or that day, having made my reservation, booked my tea at the Ritz, I was riding around on top of a double-decker red bus as kind of a final tour of London. And the gentleman doing the tourist guide was a sergeant major retired in the Army. And as we drove up Piccadilly, he said to the group, and he said, ahead of us, he said, is the wonderful Ritz Hotel. And he said, now, none of the likes of you or me would be welcome there, he said, but posh
Oh.
people go there for tea. And, it really threw me, Sally, recognizing that even if a not posh person had wanted to spend the money, they wouldn't necessarily be either welcome or comfortable.
I think, well, yeah, I think the Ritz, it ought to be, and I think it is sufficiently um, enlightened to be nice to everyone who comes through its doors.
Well, but
Um,
nevertheless, there
but
is
it's
a
a, you
sort
know,
of
it's a very grand environment. So, yeah.
there's a kind of freezing politeness that can descend upon people, but Americans seem to get an exception to it. Maybe that was a long time ago. I think it was probably in the 80s, 1980s. So
Yes.
maybe things have relaxed more. But even when I was studying at Oxford that summer, there was a difference, they would let us, for example, wander around in the Fellows Garden, whereas if a British student tried it, they'd have been completely frozen out. So I've always kind of enjoyed that. But anyway, I got to see the temple as Sally describes it. And should you go to London, you can peer through the bars of the gate on the
Yes,
embankment.
you can. I mean, if you're there in daytime hours, although it looks very enclosed and there are porters on the gates, you can indeed walk through, and at some times of the day you can go into the gardens, which are open to the public for sort of a couple of hours at lunchtime, and the temple church is open to tourists every day, and is the most incredible historic building.
Yeah.
So there, lots of people are coming in and out. But you're right. I mean, it's. I think the bars are psychological to some extent because it's very closed off with teeming Fleet Street and the teeming embankment, and then this little oasis of ancient buildings and gardens. And there are porters at the gates, so that people have the impression, that it's a sort of private little world, and to some extent it is. But no, American tourists are very welcome.
Good to know. Well, there is a map in the book, and there was a map in the
Yes.
earlier book, A Case of Mice and Murder, which is very helpful because the actual geography and layout of the temple grounds can play, especially in the first book, an important role, but also in this one in a very different sense. And I do recommend when you finish the book, but not before, that you read Sally's note about what is real and what isn't, which is very helpful. But the thing that is critical to understanding how these books work is that the temple operates like the Vatican. And so when a crime is committed there in 1901, merging into 1902, in this second book, that London police can't just storm in. They actually have to be invited.
No, that's absolutely true. And people find, and it is true to this day. I mean, people find it very hard to believe. And of course, in practice, it would never arise. I mean, if there were a crime in the Temple, the City of London police would be involved. But technically, they're only allowed into the Temple by consent, and the policing is in conjunction with our own private porters who run all our inner security. And as I say, people find it very hard to believe, and it's one of the very, very few places where it applies. But the land, it's a 15-acre site. And I should have said, by the way, I'm inclined to swap between talking about the inner and middle temple and talking about the temple. But the inner and middle temple are linked with just a tiny passageway between them, and the area collectively is called the temple. And it happens to be that I'm in the inner temple, and so the books are about the inner temple. But many of these oddities apply just as much to the middle temple. So the temple generally is what's called an ancient liberty. It's 15 acres of land, which is outside the jurisdiction of the City of London. Although it's within the square mile of the city, it's a local authority in its own right. We have our own parliament, and we, although of course we sign up to all the things like street lighting and refuse collection and all the other things that everyone else in London signs up to, it is with our agreement. And as far as the police are concerned, no one has ever actually tested what the true legal position is, and it would never arise, as it does in my novels nowadays, that we would say to the police, no, sorry, we've had a terrible crime committed here and you can't come in. But it is a wonderful and true setup for a mystery novel, because it is the true locked room, really, with porters on all the gates, so people can't get in and out without being seen to do so. And as I say, an amateur detective who's left in charge because the police aren't allowed in either.
Exactly, which is why Gabriel Ward KC is now working his second murder case.
Absolutely.
And additionally, the other part I really love about these books is that he's not just investigating a murder, because he, in his own practice, is generally involved in some kind of, legal dispute. So in the first book, it was a copyright case relating to a children's book in which there was a mouse. So hence the title, A Case of Mice and Murder. And so, you're both caught up in the murder investigation, but you also, you're really worried about how the copyright case is going to come out. So is there a secondary case in A Case of Life and Limb that Gabriel is working as well?
Yes, there is indeed. And the reason I do that with the books is because he's first and foremost, he's amateur detective, and he's first and foremost a barrister. And if you're a barrister, you are always obsessed with the next case, so you're always working very hard, and it's very high pressured. And so it didn't seem right for Sir Gabriel not to be conducting a case, even though he was being a detective. So that was the rationale behind it. And in the second one is a defamation case for a young actress who sues the newspaper. Remember, this is 1902 we're in now. Who sues a newspaper for sort of imputations on her chastity. And she gets very upset about this, and Gabriel conducts a case on her behalf against the newspaper.
Which you call the nation's voice. Was it modeled on
Yes.
any particular tabloid in London?
Not really, not nowadays one. No. I mean, there were a number with names like that in the early 1900s, not the same. So I made it up, but it's, as I say, there were a lot called things like the Echo and the People, and those sort of democratic names. So I came up with that one.
Well, I mean, today we have the internet where you can do defamation without even identifying yourself a lot of the time. But it may be hard for modern readers to realize just how impactful newspapers were. They didn't come out just once a day. I mean, even when I was a child in Chicago, there was a morning paper, the Chicago Tribune, and an afternoon paper, the Chicago Daily News, and special editions would be, run out
Mm,
in the event of breaking news and
yes,
all the rest of it. So the
yes.
newspaper was far more powerful.
Absolutely, they were very powerful, and I mean the case in my book is modelled on a number at that time because
Hmm,
early 1900s there were a number of actresses who sued newspapers for suggesting, that they were sort of being paid for sex just because they were appearing on stage in chorus lines, wearing less than in 1900 people were used to seeing, and and so, as I say, there were a number of cases, and so it seemed, although mine is fictional, it seemed sort of suitable. And as you say, the newspapers were incredibly powerful, and people's reputations were literally ruined overnight by them.
yeah, well, as we see can happen today. You know, people ask me why I call the bookstore the poisoned pen, and I remind them that in Agatha Christie's day and so forth, that the kind of stuff that happens on the internet was happened by anonymous letters, where somebody would trash a person by sending letters around in the village,
Absolutely,
anonymously.
absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it was an absolute, so they were called poison pen letters. And
Mm, mm.
we had to call it poison pen because somebody else already had a site called Poison Pen, which was which was some infamous and unpleasant. And so the ED has thrown people all these years, but
But it's a great name, I must say. I mean, I was very struck by it when I first heard it.
well, thank you. But, it has led to many people getting the wrong domain name and all, when they write to us because they forget it. I actually had to bribe the person because to trademarks or however it all went, trademark the bookstore name and all. We had to get the consent of the person who had
Oh,
poison,
of course, yes,
and that
yes.
person refused. And finally, my trademark lawyer called me in somewhat despair and said, I just can't get her to sign off on this. And I said, well, let me try. And here's the power of books. So we discussed it, and she was pretty adamant. And finally, I said to her, do you have a favorite author? And she said, yes, she did. I won't identify who it was. But luckily, it was a favorite author that was also an author that I knew very well. And so I
Oh,
said to her, so if I could promise you, I said, going forward, a signed copy of every book that this author writes, would that be enough to get you to let us know our store, The Poison Pen? And she agreed. You know,
oh, that's great.
isn't it
Well, as you
wonderful?
say, that is the power of books. Yes.
Absolutely. So it was a new run, whether we actually got to call the bookstore the Poison Pen at all. But so it goes. And I've had to defend that name. Has been challenged twice in Canada and once in New York by
Oh,
people
really?
who didn't understand that you can't just open a store called the Poison Pen in Toronto. You know,
No, no, of course, of
you
course.
have to defend it. Right. So we ended up with a Canadian firm on that. And I love the name. It was called Smart and Biggers, which I think is one of the great names for a law firm. Anyway, we prevailed. They had to find another name.
Well done.
Right, thank you. So anyway, Gabriel Ward KC, he's hard at work on this music hall star Topsy
Mhm.
Tillotson's libel case. And then something happens to kick off this story. What is it?
Well, the members of the Inner Temple, the treasurer, who is the head of the Inner Temple, and subsequently other members receive parcels. The first one, wrapped up as a Christmas present. And this isn't a plot spoiler because it happens in the first few pages of the book. And when he opens it, it contains a body part, a hand, accompanied by a note which says, "Can I give you a hand?" Um, and then there are other body parts in parcels. Nobody knows where the body is or who's sending the body parts or why. And so Gabriel is roped in to start to investigate.
So who is the recipient of these packages?
Well, the first, as I say, is the head of the inner temple is called the treasurer, although he's not associated with the money. That's just an ancient title, and he is a distinguished barrister or judge who's elected to be in that role. And in my books, the treasurer receives the "Can I give you a hand" parcel. And then subsequently, another member of the bar, another barrister, receives a foot with a note, "Don't put your foot in it." You can imagine I had some fun coming up with these notes. And then I won't spoil the story, but subsequently, the shock is too much for somebody that one of these parcels is sent to, and he dies as a result of opening it, and that starts a murder investigation.
So Sir William Waring, is it Waring or Waring?
Yes,
Waring,
yes.
right. And Gabriel tend to clash sometimes. Sir William has very high standards about, the proper behavior of
Yes.
of the barristers in the temple, and he disapproves somewhat of Gabriel. And to that end, you introduce a cat into this book, which adds to Sir William's general disdain for Gabriel. But I really enjoyed the cat because Gabriel is a pretty solitary man.
Yes, he is, and I think the cat. I mean, I'm more of a dog person than a cat person, but I think Gabriel it would be a cat person. He has the same sort of characteristics of sort of aloofness and self-containment, and and so a cat, well, the story is such that he ends up with the cat, and the cat chooses him rather than him choosing the cat. And they get along together in a slightly detached relationship, which I hope is the kind of relationship which is suitable for him to have. I didn't he's a solitary person, so he didn't want to have anybody. He didn't want an emotional involvement, but he unwittingly acquires one in that, I think that an affection grows up between him and the cat. But as I said, it's the cat who does all the running.
That's very true. But I do think that, yeah, some kind of companionship for Sir Gabriel, it was a great idea to introduce it. And, cats are reasonably self-sufficient. As the owner of 3 dogs, I can tell you the dogs are not. They require,
No.
basically, it's like having toddlers to have puppies.
Yeah.
I mean, it really is, and so I don't think that they would, on a practical basis, they take too much time. But on a
Yes, and I
practical
think
basis, they're too needy.
yes, yeah, they're needy, and I think, I mean, the attractive thing about dogs is the fact that they love you. That there's an interaction. And as I say, I myself more of a dog person than a cat person, but the self-sufficiency and absorption, self-absorption. I mean, the cat's a pretty selfish cat, and in many ways, I think Gabriel is quite a selfish man. He's a nice man, but he wants life on his own terms. And so there's the interesting dynamic of them both wanting life on their own terms.
Yes, I think so too. No, I thought it was very suitable. I really did enjoy that. So going back to the fact that it was more than one person, I mean, initially one could imagine that maybe Sir William Waring was targeted,
Yes,
for the recipient
yes,
for receiving the hand. But then as these parcels with body parts and notes arrive for other people, then it becomes clear that it's not something directed just at an individual in the temple, but rather somebody that must have a grudge or something going on
yes.
in their emotional makeup with the temple itself. And we can't say any more about that, but I thought you did a brilliant job in
Thank
figuring
you.
out what was happening here. When World War II bombed part of London, did it reveal some structures or some things at the temple that had been buried for a long time? Because the
It did
temple really got
indeed.
hit.
Yes, it did. It did. It got very badly hit, and it's been a miracle of restoration, really. That, I mean, the church was very badly damaged, and you would never know it now. But some of the buildings were are now facsimiles of what they originally were, and yes, and all kinds of things were revealed, including a great many of the graves and the vaults where the Templars had been buried over the centuries and then had been closed up, and nobody really knew they were there again, and they were revealed again by the bomb damage. And there are some extraordinary pictures of the night after the bombing.
Really?
With, I mean, just extraordinary, with the fronts of buildings missing and sort of laid waste. And there's a wonderful account that there was a writer called H.V. Morton who wrote travel books, but he wrote one about London, and he tells this extraordinarily moving story of how he walked through the Temple a few days after the bomb, and the fronts of the buildings of many of the barristers' chambers had been blown off. And the barristers were sitting there at their desks in their overcoats, working as though nothing had happened. I mean, it was an extraordinary story. So no, so it's had a romantic past, over the. I mean, many things have happened, because it's been 3 times ravaged by fire over the centuries, and it's had a war, and it's had riots. I mean, the Gordon riots, which were huge riots in London, they all took place around the Temple, and there were people beating on the doors, and on the massive oak doors to get in. And so, as I say, the history just oozes out of the pavements, really, when you walk around it.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, the one thing that has stayed a constant is the actual ground itself. I mean, not necessarily,
Yes.
you know,
Yes.
the size of it or the acreage, although undoubtedly there have been, many alterations to that. I mean, I sort of forget that the embankment, really chopped off land going down to the river. And I
Yes.
think if I remember that part of a temple garden, if you're on the embankment, is to one, it's on the other side of the road from the temple. You have to go across the embankment and descend down into the garden by the river.
No, not quite. Well, nowadays the embankment separates the Thames from the temple.
Right.
It runs straight along the bottom of the garden. Before, I mean, and I never remember the date, but the embankment was built around about. I mean, I'm really guessing, and there's probably someone listening who'll say, "Gosh, that's wrong," but I think it's about 1880
Yeah,
something.
it was Victorian. That
Yes,
part
it
I
was
do
certainly
remember.
Victorian.
Right.
Yes, and as a result, before that, our gardens in the temple, ran straight down to the water's edge, as
Exactly.
you say. And there's some very, very beautiful paintings of how it looked in those days. It must have been wonderful. But the temple did a deal, so that when the embankment was built, they had a bit of land given to them, and buildings put onto it. Um, and they lost the bit of garden that went down to the river,
Right. Well, I mean,
basically.
in for centuries, lots of the mansions and other important buildings in London did their grounds
They
ran
did.
right down to the
Mm,
river. The
mm.
embankment really separated.
Yes, and it's sad in
Oh,
a way because it separates the River Thames off. I mean, it's now a great big concrete steps
yes.
and things to get down to it, whereas before, it flowed along.
Right. I made the mistake of approaching Somerset House from the embankment, and that it's a whole different feeling than when it
Yes,
was,
yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
before. But obviously, there were reasons why, I don't know, whatever reasons they put in the embankment. Maybe it was just to improve traffic, or I don't know. Why did they?
I
Do you
think it
know?
was. Well, I think it was a traffic because, of course, the other side is Fleet Street and the Strand, which are really pretty narrow and
Right.
very congested roads. If we didn't have the embankment, I don't know how anyone would move around London at all. It's bad enough now.
Yes, no, I can understand that, but I've always kind of liked that idea, some of those great noble houses, Elizabethan times
Mm,
and all,
mm.
they're running down there. And of course, a lot of the rivers were more free flowing in those days too. I mean, the Fleet
Yes,
is actually a river. I think the river still flows under Fleet Street, if I remember
does. It
right.
still flows under. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And there's
So,
actually a drain where you can see it. You can peer down at it and you can hear it down it. Um, and I find that an extraordinary thought that it's running out but beneath the feet, your feet, as you're walking along the pavements.
well, there's a whole bunch of rivers. If you look, there's an interesting guy that has a Substack. Matt Brown, his name is, and I'm trying to remember what he I just saw it this morning because I read it all the time. But anyway, he's interested in historic London. He's forever, going back and looking up monuments and, tunnels under
Mm,
the river
mm.
and all the rest of it. And he has a map of, I think, 1500s London. I might be wrong. It might be a little bit later. But anyway, he's been engaged because it was black and white and coloring it in. And in order to show all the highlights, where, and he uses colors to say, okay, these were fields. And, here was
Oh,
a river. And
lovely. Yes.
it's really fast. I'll send you a link to it because I really
Oh,
love
thank you.
reading it.
I'd love to see that.
Yeah,
Thank
if
you.
you would. And anyway, but it does remind you, just how ancient London is, like
Mm,
him going
mm.
all the way back to the Romans and how it's much of it is an accumulation of buildings, I'm
Yes,
sorry,
yes,
villages, that were, around
yes,
and then
absolutely.
gradually have gotten, and then, rivers paved over and all that. And then we could talk about, the Great Stink and the London sewers and,
Yeah.
I
And the
mean,
names too. I mean, Lincoln's Inn Fields,
yeah,
which is now, as you know, a green square with buildings around it. But I mean, originally that truly was fields. And
exactly.
the young barristers who were in Lincoln's Inn used to go and hunt rabbits in it. I mean, it was a wild area. It wasn't city at all. It's very, very hard to imagine, I think, actually, when
Well, yeah, looking
how
at
it
it
was.
today, but
Yes.
it does help to, let me see if I can fit Matt while we're talking here. So what else would you like to say? I mean, I'm reluctant to go too much into the plot of this book because there's so many spoilers available, but talk to us a little bit about Gabriel and the colleague that he does acquire in the London police who, who
Yes.
work with him.
Well,
And you have to sort of have a real policeman to arrest people at some point.
you do, and as you say, he becomes a friend of a young police constable, in his early 20s, who's just joined the City of London Police, and who he comes from a background so different from Gabriel's that one can scarcely imagine it. I mean, he left school at 14 and has never had a book in his house, and he lives with his large family in the East End of London. And Gabriel, as a detective, was a public school and Oxford educated, and
Right.
comes from an aristocratic family. And so, I mean, and the class divides in the early 1900s really were unimaginably deep. I mean, there was a chasm between people, I think, and um, and so both Constable Wright and Sir Gabriel have to navigate across that chasm, and they start off at arm's length from each other, and they don't think they've got anything in common. And I mean, it's rather as you were saying about going to the Ritz Hotel.
Yes,
Constable
exactly.
Wright was intimidated by the temple, and he thought, they were all incredibly grand and fantastically clever, and he got nothing really that he could contribute. But he's a kind, robust, clever young man. And to Gabriel, I think it's difficult for Gabriel as well, because Gabriel was unused to mixing even with people from his own background,
Right.
because he was reclusive, let alone with whom he had nothing in common. And they discover that they do have things in common, and that things like kindness and cleverness and all kinds of other sensitivity, all kinds of characteristics go straight across the divide, and it doesn't matter what background you come from. And they've slowly, I hope, as the books develop, they discover that. And as I say, by the second one, they've become friends. Although
Right.
even that Constable Wright makes some remark about being a friend, and then backs off and is embarrassed by it and says, "Oh, I didn't mean that disrespectfully." And so that they're all the time. And sometimes Gabriel oversteps the mark, and he's a bit too sort of patrician, and he steps back and realizes that he's behaving in this sort of entitled way that he shouldn't be. So in the end, they get there.
They do get there, but there seems to be a kind of a barrier to intimacy oftentimes when you're reading about, um, you know, in various ways. British, keeping yourself to yourself is considered a virtue.
Mm.
And,
Mm.
part of it, I think, may be that chasm, that keeps people in there. I thought about that the other day, when we were traveling we're going to Singapore, but we've been to Hong Kong and other places, but not India, although that's coming up. And there's always been that conversation about, no dogs or Indians allowed or something like that, which is very
Mm.
offensive. But the truth
Mm.
is that the British have always done that with other people in Britain. I mean, I still remember, some of the signs at Oxford about, who could go where. Um, there's always been,
Yes.
chasms created in people knowing their place, like giving housekeepers, if you read Victorian literature, where they get a title called Mrs., but, generally they're not. Generally they're single.
Yes. Yes.
And, upstairs,
Yes.
downstairs, that is in fact
Yes.
a very different world, and that gets written up a lot. So I think for Americans, it's a lot harder to understand that everybody respects that on both sides.
Mm.
It isn't just
Mm.
from top
Mm.
down, it also from bottom up.
Mm. Yes. Well, I mean, I do see. I mean, you are sadly right, but I hope and believe that it's become much, much less so in England. But
I
but
think
of course,
so.
I'm writing about a time when it was very marked. And indeed, the third book, which I'm in the midst of
Oh,
writing,
good.
has a has a young Indian
Ah,
student who comes to practice in the Inner Temple, and this was at the time when students were being sent over under the colonial program to train them up as English barristers to send them home to practice English law in English in India. I mean, all the stuff we all know about, and so that was another chasm, and I'm amazed at it. I mean, doing the research on it, it's extraordinary. But you have to take it. I think you have to deal with it, and the same is true of sort of social class. It's no good applying 2025. You have to allow Gabriel to be a kind, sensitive man of his time. You
exactly.
can't, make him a 2025 person pretending to live in 1903 and saying how appalling it all is. Um, and so that's quite a difficult path to tread sometimes. But I hope
But
I do
in
so.
order to write real historical fiction, you have to be able to do that. We just recently did a Jane Austen discussion at the bookstore with some scholars, and they have a tendency to want to apologize, for some of, I mean, I'm a Georgette Hare reader, so, there was
Who
a,
are you? I have a
absolutely.
lifetime's passion for Georgette Hare
I can quote you, I can quote you
too.
whole passages of Georgette Hare.
I
Bravo,
can
cried
too.
the rector, forgetting his cloth and her cotillion, which I love. But anyway, in discussing the Grand Sophie, for example, they object to what they think is the anti-Semitism, where in point of fact, it really isn't. Well, I mean, it
Mm,
is in a way, but so
it
it's
is, yeah.
merchant Venice.
Mm,
But, but it was at the time. That was how. And I don't think that, I mean, if you look at Raymond Chandler, I'm always pointing that out to people who start ranting in about, well, it was colonialism or it was whatever.
mm,
If you read Raymond Chandler today in America, he is so offensive. I mean,
yes,
the
yes,
language, but, you have to respect the fact that he was mirroring his own time and the way people
yes,
and the way people talked, and to critique him on the basis of how we might do it today. Really,
yes. Absolutely. And I think you have to, I mean, that there are, that I truly believe that there are sort of human characteristics that transcend these barriers and always have done, so that, the kind people of every generation have actually recognized the evils of their own generation. I mean, there were people who were anti-slavery at the time when it was rife at the time. I mean, and I think one has to try and reflect that. And but even though they are kind, decent people and they react against what they see as cruelty, they express it in a slightly different way. Than you would if you were talking about it in 2025. They just did, because they had completely different cultural references for their whole lives. And getting that over a historical novel is, I mean, it's a very interesting, and one can only do the best one can. And of course, one's always aware that I mean, I have my own overlay of cultural references in 2025, and I can't get away from them. I can't turn myself into Sir Gabriel Ward in 1903. So it's an
Right.
interesting
It also can affect plotting. For example, going back to Agatha Christie and Poison Pen Letters, shame was a real thing and hard for people to bear. Today, shame is practically glorified. I mean, look at our president, a ghastly example. And
yes.
so what might have driven crime, in a historical period might be completely blown off today, and everybody would go,
Oh,
"Well, what was that about?"
absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, one of the huge things, of course, was the sort of era of Victorian crime, when there were a lot of domestic murders. And people forget that it was just about impossible to divorce.
Yeah.
So, they were driven to extremes of emotion, which nowadays you think, well, why on earth did you do that? Why didn't you just walk away? But they couldn't walk away. And women, of course, couldn't walk away because economically they couldn't. So all those things play in.
Yeah, it was even worse than that because they lost control of their children as well. I mean,
Oh,
it was not
absolutely.
only an
Yes.
economic disaster, the absolute best thing to have been for a long time, for centuries, was a widow, because by then you weren't constrained by the things that happened to supposedly
Yes.
pure maidens. And, it was the freest, I think, and you could own property and your children,
Yes.
the whole
Yes.
bit. And
Absolutely.
so I can understand why women might very well have wanted to rid themselves of a husband,
Yes.
but it was also true the other
Yes.
way around that, uh,
Yes.
yeah, no, I mean, you can tell that I read far more historical fiction than is probably good for you.
I'm beginning to. Yes.
Yes. Well, I've always loved it. I'm an historian by training and you know, in graduate work at universities and so forth. So I do tend to skew that way. I love biographies too. I've always been,
Yeah, I do too. But
yeah.
I think with I do. I mean, I read more biography than I do fiction, I think, actually. But I also think that, I mean, there is no better way actually of getting a reflection of a time than to read the contemporaneous fiction of that time. Um,
No,
the-
truly, and letters. If you can find,
yes.
a cache of letters, that oftentimes is, I mean, I've never really forgiven Cassandra for burning Jane Austen's letters. What a cruel thing to do. And who was the explorer guy that Sir Richard, whatever it was, whose very proper wife, remember,
Oh,
burned,
Sir Richard Burton.
ex- yeah, burned,
Bur
burned. And I don't
Burton.
think it
Yes.
was it
Oh,
Burton? The discoverer of the night, the guy that went up to the
yes.
waters, was it Burton?
I
Right.
think it was Burton.
And
Yes.
anyway, he was a great linguist and, did all these things. And again,
Yes. Yes. It
you
was
know,
Burton.
she burned his work and papers. And it makes you so angry, to think that all of that is lost because of someone's definition of what was proper at the time, or they didn't want to be shamed. Or I think in
Yes.
Cassandra's case, genuinely to protect her sister's privacy. I don't think it was
Yes.
about shame at all. I think it was, privacy was but still, it's a loss, looking back. You would love to know, um, you know, you'd love to know what Jane thought more than you
Oh,
opportunity
absolutely.
to. Yeah.
Yes.
Well,
absolutely.
I'm mentioning Jane because her 250th birthday comes up on December 16th. So,
Yes, indeed. Yes,
yeah,
I know about that because I live in Bath. Our main house is in Bath,
right. You
and
can hardly
so
avoid it. Yep, there you
you
are
can
with the
hold.
Bell Crescent.
In
I
fact,
wish
dare I
that
say it, we're beginning to get a bit sick of Jane Austen.
I'm
It's
sure you
absolutely
are.
everywhere at present.
I thought that I don't remember what it was called, but there were lots of photographic depictions of people in costumes and, in Bath
Yes.
sometime
Yes, oh
this
yes,
year.
they all parade the streets weekends, which
Yes.
is quite fun actually. I mean,
I
they
know.
look
It's
great.
amazing. Right. Well, anyway, let's call Patrick up and see if we have any questions or anything from the audience. I'm sincere when I say that I think we've given you all the information that we should give you about A Case of Life and Limb, except I forgot to mention this. It's a Christmas mystery. And notice the snowflakes on the American cover, which are missing
Yes,
from the British cover. But
that's
so
quite
this
true.
yeah, but it is a Christmas mystery and therefore an excellent book to be picking up right now. Patrick,
Yep. Okay, there is a question here. Renee would like to know, Sally, do you plot out your books?
Oh, well, hello to Renee. And the answer to that is much less than many people do who write detective novels. I mean, I've learned that because, I'm new to it really. And I meet people who are writing them and who have all these sort of different colored cards and great big plans and diagrams all over their desks. And I don't have any of that. I mean, I have a basic plot which I have to have because the publishers obviously have to have a synopsis of what I'm planning to do. But other than that, no, I make it up to some extent as I go along, and I hold it all in my head, and it just sort of emerges.
Okay. So Robin has a question for you. She says, if there's time, can you ask her what is her favorite treasure on the bookcase behind her?
Goodness, I don't know how much of it's visible. Um, But the top, sort of second shelf down, is a whole range of pale red covers, which are an extraordinary series called the Notable British Trial series. And I used to buy them for a few pounds when I was a law student, and now they're really very, very hard to find. And they are transcripts of all the sort of big criminal trials, murder trials in the over the centuries, a transcript of the evidence with an analysis
hmm,
by a sort of well-known writer at the beginning. And I do recommend them if you stumble across them in a secondhand bookshop. They're fascinating. There's everything from Oscar Wilde's trial to, many of the sort of big Victorian murders, Crippen. Um, my mind's now blank. Sorry, I'm looking behind me. But all the murders that George Orwell in his article said, with the sort of golden age of murders, these classic murders, real life murders, and the transcripts of the actual trials are all in these books. So the answer is they're my little pride collection. I'm very fond of them. If I find one, I buy it and add to them. There are about 50 in all. I've got about 25 of them.
Do you find yourself going back to them and reading them just for fun?
Well, not exactly for fun, because I wouldn't like anyone to think they were fun. But before I wrote fiction, I wrote a biography of an Edwardian barrister who was very famous in England for getting more people off the death penalty than anyone else. And he figured in many of those trials. So I've used them for research. And I've actually written the so-called Green Bicycle murder in England, which was a very famous trial in 1920, I think. And I've written a small book about that. So I frequently use them for research purposes. And they're useful for legal language of the time and procedure and all that kind of stuff.
Okay, let's see. Eric asks, in your research, what was the most interesting discovery for you?
Um, ooh, I'm not sure. I'm just trying to think that through. I think, I mean, some curious things which I've been involved with the Inner Temple Library and Archives for many years, but that doesn't mean that I know everything or even the majority of things in these vast collections. And in the first book, A Case of Mice and Murder, there's I won't spoil the plot for anyone who's going to read it, but it revolves to some extent around a coronation ball. And I discovered the Inner Temple had absolutely everything relating to the coronation ball for Edward VII, including all the menus and the invitation cards and the dance cards filled in and the flower arrangements. And so that, there was this whole world and that the way the gardens were illuminated. So you could sort of build up a complete picture of this one sort of hugely festive, important night in the inn. And I had no idea any of it existed. So that was fascinating.
So you're talking about something specific to the temple when
Yes.
at the coronation. It wasn't part of the coronation otherwise.
No. It was just that because it's a ancient institution in London, it had a huge. It always has sort of events
Right.
which mirror the big historical events in London. So, but I mean, involving the most the Lord Chief Justices of many countries and general huge grandeur. Mm.
There was a conversation earlier in the program about cats and dogs, and
Yes.
people are weighing in a little bit, and they'd like to know what kind of dogs do you have?
I don't have one at all,
You don't have
sadly,
a
at the
dog at all?
moment. Not at
Yeah.
the moment, so I'm sorry about that. But I was brought up with beagle hounds, and I love beagles. And if I had another dog, I mean, it's really not conducive to the kind of life I've got at the moment, particularly with a lot of traveling backwards and forwards from London. But if I have another dog, I'd have a beagle, I think.
They have so much personality. They
They
really
have
do.
so much personality, yes.
Yeah, and they're a convenient size. It's
They
just,
are a convenient
yeah,
size and they don't shed much hair either,
no,
oddly, because they're very sleek and neat.
yes, they
Yes,
are.
but they're lovely dogs. They're very kind dogs. They're wonderful with children. They're just nice dogs.
Snoopy was a beagle, right?
He
Mhm.
was,
Yeah,
yes,
or he is. Yeah,
Yeah,
is, yes.
eternal Snoopy.
right.
That's about it for the questions.
Great. So when I mentioned earlier that I am very fond of the Substack by a man named Matt Brown, who writes about
Yes,
historic London. I've sent it to you, Sally, but it's
thank
called
you.
Londonist: Time Machine. You can subscribe to it, and I mean, his range is amazing, and he has actually made a career out of it. He does take people who meet up to do things like, walk one of the tunnels or go explore gardens or whatever it might be. And then he has some colleagues that work with him, and he's doing or did a book signing for a book that he has written at, I think, might have been Waterstones in Piccadilly or something. But the one I sent you was then he picked out five crime novels that he was recommending based on London history.
Mhm.
And I want to
I'd love
recommend,
to see that.
yeah, no,
Yes,
it's in your inbox and you can
thank you.
subscribe to it and it has an archive. But for those of you who are interested in this kind of thing, the late Christopher Fowler, who was a really wonderful author, wrote a whole series of books. I can't, Patrick, do you remember the name of the sleuth? There were two eccentric
Yeah,
police.
Bryant and May.
Yeah, that's it. The Bryant and May mysteries. And one of them, apropos to what Sally and I were talking about earlier about the fleet and the rivers, is that the premise of the book was that a woman was found drowned in a perfectly dry room. And it was a real locked room mystery. And it all had to do with the London rivers. And, and so he,
Oh, I must try that.
oh, it's a wonderful book. I'll look up the title and send it to you. But he reigned all around London, and these Bryant and May, these old eccentric policemen, really gave you a look into much of historic London. Um,
Well, I can give you a small insight into that, which you may not know. But I
okay.
mean, I don't know these books at all. But do you know? I know what he's taken Bryant and May from, because
Oh,
Bryant and May, when you run in, when you run into Liverpool Street Station from the east of England into London, you go past this huge, disused factory, and across it in faded paint it says Bryant and May, home of British matches. And they were the first people to make, commercial matches, the sort you light fires with. So I'm sure they've taken that as the name of their detectives from that.
he certainly could have. I mean, I love the way that he combined a contemporary mystery with historic
Yes,
London. And
yes,
but
yes.
I think he made me, in whichever book that was, so aware of the fact that London, that because the Thames is is a giant drain, it's
Mm,
draining all
mm, mm.
the water, it's a big watershed, whatever the word is you want to call it. And so inevitably there were all kinds of small rivers and larger rivers draining into it. And a lot of
Yes,
them, as Sally and I were talking about, are now paved over.
Well,
And
there's
so
also, don't
you
forget
can't see
that
them.
that author Ben Aronovich, who I think he's classified in the science
Yes,
fiction
he is. Yeah.
fantasy, but he has that Rivers of London series.
Yes, he does. That's
Yeah.
right.
oh,
Yeah, good point. So there is opportunity to, and somebody wrote a really interesting book, and I have absolutely no memory of who it was or whatever, but about the problem with the sewers and when the London sewers were redesigned. I mean, because the Thames was filthy, I mean, it
yes. And
was
you
a
can,
river.
I mean, there's an absolute sort of network underneath London of sewers. And
Mhm.
I know I don't, you can't go down as a tourist, but it is
No,
possible to go down, and engineers go down. And there's a very interesting book called, I think it's about Hatton Garden, and I think it's called Street of Diamonds.
yeah,
And the author of that, she is taken down by the authorities, and there are wonderful descriptions of these sort of cavernous sewers under that whole bit of the city, because Hatton Garden, of course, is very close to Fleet Street. So
right.
it's an
I mean,
interesting
when you
area.
think about, old cities, I mean, you can go back and look at Troy and you had to, drill down, and nobody's entirely sure if they ever actually found Troy itself, but,
Mm,
multiple layers,
mm,
or,
mm.
Paris and the catacombs, or
Absolutely.
whatever,
Yes.
I've been in a church in Rome where you can descend down through time to the Mithrae, some Mithraeum at the bottom, and
Yes.
then there's an old Christian church, and then there's, the modern church, the whole bit. When you have
Mm,
ancient cities, there are layers and layers as the city builds up.
mm,
And
mm.
and so there's a lot going on underneath, which in fact is relevant to a case of life. So on that note, Sally, what a pleasure to talk to you again. Thank you.
Absolutely. It's a great pleasure. Thank you very much
You're
indeed.
welcome. Wishing you a
Thank you for
happy
having me.
holiday, wishing everybody, and if you'd like a Christmas mystery with snowflakes on the cover, this is your chance. And I really will put in the paperback edition of A Case of Mice and Murder that you can order momentarily. So thanks very much.